I watched in horror as my favorite SUV collided with a telephone pole under the freezing December night sky. The car's body started to get covered with snow, and the chrome accents gleamed icily. This scenario appeared to hint to our family's imminent disintegration. But in order to relate this narrative, I had to start far earlier because our family's distortions started a long time ago. Kristen Carlson is my name. Although this narrative appears to be about a vehicle disagreement, it is actually a chronicle of long-standing misconceptions in my family that suddenly erupted. The vehicle served just as a metaphor. The circumstances around it brutally exposed the things we did not want to see. All the secrets, frustrations, and wounds spilled out of what seemed to be a tranquil household. Looking back, that night marked a sea change in our family's history. There was an unwritten but acknowledged hierarchy in my family, with my brother Jonathan at the top. Jonathan was loved by both of our parents from infancy. For my parents, who had battled infertility, his birth was a blessing. But my grandma subsequently told me that when I was born a year later, my parents' happiness was not as great as it had been. Her words were, "Your mother wanted a boy." Her desire came true with the birth of Jonathan. You were a surprise present. This unanticipated present was nonetheless considered an extra. Jonathan received everything he desired. His shortcomings were overlooked, and even his violent acts were laughed at since boys will be boys. For unique reasons, Jonathan's and our family's problems were consistently ignored. However, I was reprimanded right away if I did the same. A doll I got for my 5th birthday is among my earliest recollections. I can still clearly recall the day Jonathan smashed the doll I had treasured and exhibited. "Your brother was just curious," my mother, ignoring my sobs, remarked. "It's your fault for not taking care of your things." I had to deal with such absurd circumstances on a regular basis. My belongings belonged to Jonathan as well. I lost my time, my books, and my toys under the guise of "for my brother's sake." But as a kid, I wanted to think that my family loved me because if they didn't, the everyday life would be too depressing. I was unable to avoid Jonathan's influence, even at school. I was a shy student who frequently spent time in the library, whereas he was athletic and well-liked. The peaceful library was my haven when I felt like I had nowhere to go, but I consistently maintained excellent marks. Maybe that was a last-ditch effort to get noticed. I thought that my family would finally notice me because I was unique in some manner. "Kristen, why can't you be like your brother?" my dad used to say. "Jonathan takes initiative. He's liked by everybody but you." His implication was evident even if his words died off. Jonathan's shadow never went away, no matter how hard I tried. Such circumstances were handled by our parents as though they were commonplace. These remarks, "because he's your brother, because we're family," kept stifling my emotions. In our household, it was accepted as the standard, and no one challenged it. Despite my internal resistance, the environment that prevented me from speaking up was constant, and I eventually came to understand that I was only surviving in this home. I just had a tiny bag with me when I left home on my 18th birthday. I was oddly relieved to leave the house before the sun came up. I felt as though the tremendous strain that had crushed me had been lifted as I softly shut the house's door. I just moved onward without turning around. I heard birds singing in the distance, and as the dim light started to light up the sky, I had a sudden and silent understanding that I was beginning a new life. It was my paternal Uncle Douglas who greeted me. Although I vaguely remembered meeting him as a child, we hadn't interacted much since. He had been worried about my family's circumstances for a long time, though, as a former police officer. This reminds me of my childhood visits to Uncle Douglas's place with my family. Uncle Douglas happened to overhear my parents ignoring me while praising Jonathan. "Isn't Christine a little too reserved?" My mother chuckled and remarked, "Well, she's a girl, so maybe that can't be helped." My father said, "Can't she be more outgoing like Jonathan?" Uncle Douglas checked on me from time to time later, although he didn't go into great detail about it at the time. "Is Christine all right?" he would occasionally inquire over the phone. That my parents would casually brush it off with a, "Oh, she's all fine." When I was listed among the best students by my middle school, His worry became conviction. Uncle Douglas happened to see it and wanted to commend my efforts, but when he reached out to my parents, they responded coldly. Kristen's grades are good, but more importantly, Jonathan is doing well in his new sports team, they remarked, as they shifted the conversation. Uncle Douglas became aware of my treatment in the family at that point. Since then, Uncle Douglas had made a covert commitment to always provide a helping hand when I needed it. At the age of 18, I reached out to him, and he immediately accepted me. There was a peacefulness about his house that I had never known before. The bookshelves were lined with police-related literature and publications about his interest, fishing, and the walls were decorated with pictures he had taken during his active days. Every aspect felt new to me, and everything seemed to capture his personality. Uncle Douglas gave me a tiny room and said, "Here, you can be yourself." Despite its modest size, the room was cozy thanks to its warm oak furnishings and soft draperies. I was so happy to have my own space for the first time that night that I started crying. Unable to control the feelings I had been suppressing, I buried my head in the pillow. When Uncle Douglas was a police officer, he utilized his SUV, which he handed to me. Although it wasn't in ideal shape, the inside was kept up nicely, and the engine was strong. He said, "I have a special attachment to this car," as he touched the hood. "Kristen, I believe you will take good care of it." For me, the vehicle became more than simply a way to go about. It was a tribute to my new life and represented freedom and independence. I always felt as though I was entering a larger universe when I drove. I was reminded that I was alive by the sensation of the steering wheel and the tremors I experienced as I pressed the throttle. I developed a regular routine of polishing the automobile before work, which is similar to meditation. I felt my thoughts slowly coming into alignment as I used a handkerchief to clean the body. When the engine started, it sounded like a hopeful pulse. When I initially drove the automobile across the city, I can still clearly recall the feeling of freedom and the coolness of the wind. My spirit was gradually restored by life with Uncle Douglas. We used to giggle over stories about his fishing expeditions and his stint as a police officer over dinner time. Those quiet times were quite valuable to me. Even though I wasn't used to being adored, Uncle Douglas respected my presence and was always at my side. I started to realize what it meant to be myself for the first time. For me, the days I spent in his house were becoming a new kind of family. Uncle Douglas's statement, "Family is determined by bonds, not blood," struck a profound chord with me. Jonathan, however, had a turbulent life. He was hailed as a top athlete in high school. But once he started college, things did not work out for him. He was given a scholarship at first, and as a member of the American football team, he lived a lavish lifestyle. However, his delight in ostentatious play and lack of effort focused on his grades. He eventually had to leave school. He worked at a number of positions for 2 years, but none of them lasted long because of disagreements with managers or accusations of his carelessness. Despite Jonathan's constant boasts that I can do bigger things, reality rejected him. His carelessness also showed out in his personal life, where he had issues with speeding and intoxicated driving, which resulted in the damage of 3 vehicles. The worst part was when he crashed the last automobile into a telephone pole and totally destroyed it. He lost his ability to possess a car after the insurance company declined to extend his contract. But he still had an infatuation with vehicles. Eventually, this obsession brought his eyes to my beloved SUV. For the first time in a long time, I was spending Christmas night with my family at my parents' house. A letter from my mother was the reason I went to see my estranged relatives. She had sent a short note as year-end drew near, expressing her desire for us to spend time together as a family. Despite the straightforward subject matter, I could sense the passion behind it, and after some deliberation, I chose to go. Maybe I hadn't got the guts to break off all contact with my family yet. Outside the window, snow continued to fall silently, casting a silvery white world over the surrounding area. With the fireplace blazing and the table laden with roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and green bean casserole, The living room seemed like the ideal setting for a family get-together. In good spirits, my father poured wine and my mother carried a cake from the kitchen. But I was uncomfortable as I sat there. Jonathan pretended everything was oak, but each time his eyes met mine, I felt a wave of fatigue wash over me. His interest in the SUV had been apparent to me for a long time. We had unintentionally gotten back together a few weeks before Christmas. Jonathan showed up out of nowhere one vacation while I was eating lunch at a cafe close to Uncle Douglas's house. He must have happened to see me because the apartment he was residing in at the time was close to Uncle Douglas's house. He sat down, looking astonished, and asked, "Christine, you live around here?" I was wary at first, but Jonathan immediately struck up a conversation in his typical lighthearted way and inquired about my life. At that moment, I saw his eyes move to my SUV, which was parked in the lot. His eyes brightened as he pointed out, "Hey, Kristen, is that car yours?" I said it was a gift from Uncle Douglas, and Jonathan gave me a proud nod. "It's a good vehicle. It has a powerful vibe that I adore." With a look that suggested more than just curiosity, Jonathan remarked, "I'd like one like this someday, but it's just not possible right now." Even as we talked casually, it became clear that he was obsessed with it. I became aware of Jonathan's interest in my SUV throughout our brief reconnection. Maybe that's why I still felt a little nervous that he may attack it on Christmas night. The family had gone to their rooms by the end of the night when the tragedy happened. The living room was empty except for me. I was deep in concentration as I gazed into the fireplace when I noticed my vehicle keys were gone. There was no sign of them in my luggage. A sensation of panic soon gave way to a sense of dread. The spot where the SUV had been parked was suddenly vacant as I hurried to the window. The blood in my face started to run out. I quickly reached for my phone and launched the tracking software Uncle Douglas had set up. The automobile was going many kilometers away, according to the flashing message on the screen. Without my knowledge, Jonathan had stolen my beloved SUV and grabbed my car keys. He needed the car to go a party with pals, I found out later. Why would he act in such way? Why would he use my automobile without my consent when he could not even borrow one from someone else? I kept thinking about these questions, but I felt the need to get the automobile back before I could look for solutions. As I had anticipated, Jonathan wrecked on the slippery road after mishandling the automobile while intoxicated. When I arrived at the site in a cab, I saw Jonathan being escorted away by the police while still intoxicated, and the SUV was smashed into a telephone pole. A knot formed in my breast at that sight. I treasured the automobile that Uncle Douglas had given me. More significantly, it represented my freedom, and its destruction was intolerable. What surprised me even more, though, was my parents' response. They were trying to tell lies to the police officers and had reached the spot before me. "Our daughter is the owner of the vehicle. She was behind the wheel," they argued. "Our son was just caught up in it." They were prepared to sacrifice me in order to keep their son safe, so the motivation was obvious. My daughter, Kristen, was driving. My mother told the police shakily. She became rather alarmed. We arrived to assist her. My blood seemed to have frozen at that instant. My parents had never actually wanted to protect me, and the familial distortion I had only dimly experienced up until now was glaringly obvious. Any glimmer of optimism I could have had for my family vanished in that moment. I made the decision to contact Uncle Douglas because I was feeling angry. He responded right instantly and promised to come as soon as he heard my predicament. I hoped Uncle Douglas's presence would assist bring the situation under control, because I knew he had ties to the police. Uncle Douglas eventually showed up on the scene. He carefully evaluated the issue as a former police officer and spoke with the policeman right away. He had previously worked with one of the cops on the site. "I know what took place here," he said confidently. "Jonathan was operating a stolen vehicle. Jonathan had taken my automobile, as evidenced by Uncle Douglas's confession, the CCTV footage from the location, and my car's tracking data." After a more thorough inquiry by the police, Jonathan was taken into custody for driving under the influence and without a license. His activities led to a criminal record, a fine of several $1,000s, and a license suspension for more than a year. Then, in a more heated setting than expected, the conversation over the expense of auto repair started. My father's face appeared more serious than normal under the fluorescent lights of the body shop. Jonathan volunteered to cover the whole cost of the repairs. For him, that must have been an important choice. My parents, however, took issue with his choice. My mother remarked, "There's no need for that," in a voice that was shaking. "We are related. We ought to divide the load." Something inside me was sliced open by that phrase. Feelings that I had repressed for years poured out like a dam. "Enough is enough," I yelled. "Why do you defend him every time?" "Because of you, I was forced to leave home and travel to Uncle Douglas's place. You attempted to lie to the police and are still covering for him after he took my car. And you're still meddling now that he's at last attempting to accept responsibility? What does this have to do with family?" The store became quiet. "Oh my goodness," said a client waiting for repairs at that very moment. Ordinary parents who impede their child's development. My father's self-control was broken by that remark. With unbridled rage, he attacked the stranger, who was subsequently revealed to be Michael Pfizer. Michael was slammed against the wall after my father's fists viciously smacked his face. I was paralyzed with terror. My father's aggressive inclinations, which had been displayed at home, were now on display. In a panic, my father ran away from my mother as the staff contacted the police. He was held for a few weeks before being released. He was required to participate in an anger management program while he was in custody. Group therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy were part of the program, and it undoubtedly improved my father's health. Jonathan, however, also paid a high price. He was suspended from driving for more than a year, had to pay large penalties, and was given a criminal record. He appeared to be greatly affected by this sequence of events. He changed completely, making a concerted effort to patch things up between us. He apologized several times and reflected hard on his previous misdeeds in his nearly weekly correspondence. But there was no improvement in his connection with our father. Rather, the gap between them merely widened. Their similar criminal histories in particular appeared to drive them more apart. My mother's makeover was the most startling shift. She changed completely once my father and brother were arrested. Her fury grew, and she adopted a chilly tone toward me. Her remarks were sharp, and she began to blame me for everything. "Kristen, this wouldn't have occurred if you had just lent him the automobile from the start. Our family was ruined by you. Are you content to damage our reputation?" All of these charges caused me much pain. At last, I made the decision to sever all ties with her. I didn't want to put up with her cruel remarks anymore. I chilled my sentiments for my mother and made a mistake that would never be undone. After Uncle Douglas told them the entire tale, my grandparents' reaction was unexpected. They decided to deny my parents their inheritance. My grandpa said, "Those who should protect the family but instead break it do not deserve our trust or our estate," which caused my parents much distress. My parents' lives were drastically altered by this choice. My parents no longer had the financial security they had taken for granted in the absence of the bequest from my grandparents. To maintain their opulent way of life, they had depended on the expected riches and possessions. But when that foundation was removed, their lives changed. They had to adopt a more austere lifestyle and give up their comforts. I gave it some thought when my grandparents later spoke to me about the bequest. I wanted to carefully consider how I would like my future because money was one of the things that shattered my family. We now get together once a month, and I can see Jonathan's progress since I know he is genuinely working on his recovery. He has obtained steady work and is enrolled in an alcohol addiction treatment program. It's unthinkable to see him commute by bicycle given his once haughty manner. He confesses, "I'm ashamed of my past self," acknowledging his errors and attempting to move on. We are gradually and gently reestablishing our friendship. At the same time, my father has begun to face his feelings. He actively engages in anger management sessions, exploring the causes of his aggressive inclinations, progressively thinking back on his previous deeds, and displaying sorrow. But I still don't have a relationship with my mother. I occasionally want to patch things up between us, but every time, her comments reverberate in my head, and I decide to keep my distance. It is difficult to mend the wounds from the past. A new future may be possible if you have the guts to remove such restrictions. I learned from Uncle Douglas that although individuals may change, it's not always an easy process. It frequently necessitates major sacrifices and might be traumatic. Knowing this, I want to live my life for me rather than to satisfy the expectations of others. What the terrain will be like at this time next year is unknown to me. Still, as I stare at the snow-covered SUV, I silently decide to break free from the past and go on at my own speed.